what about the paradox situation? What's going on with the Kenyan sand boa then, and why is that genetically somewhat heritable, or seems to be?
Okay, so paradoxing is one of these fun things that drives people crazy, and they want to know why you can't do it when you can do it with other animals. So the paradoxing, I will start with the term paradox in the hobby is a bastard term. It has no legitimate scientific value or credence anywhere. No actual geneticist will talk about a paradox genetics. So first wrap your head around that, and then that gives you at least a bit more understanding that what you're dealing with is something that's just anomalous, and trying to figure out why it's anomalous can then help you better understand why it's generally not heritable. Um, in most cases that we see, what it is it's a result of either chimerism or mosaicism. Um, and those are basically two fancy ways of ending up with the same thing through different routes. So a genetic mosaic animal is one that gives you two different phenotypes, but the genetics from the that cause it are from within the same animal. So we see that when like a subset of cells divides, and if they divide improperly and you get the chromosomes shift over, so that whereas normally you get one copy of each chromosome in each cell as it divides, well, maybe you end up taking two of one chromosome into one, which means the other cell has none. And if that other cell that has none was carrying a gene like a pigment gene, now you've got a cell that has no pigment genes. And if that's a precursor stem cell type thing, all the cells that it then generates have no pigment gene. So then you get these patches of non-pigmentation. But genetically, those cells have the same origin, the pigmented ones and the non-pigmented ones. Um, it's not the best example. Coming back to the mosaic thing, it's not the best example, but one that's really easy for people to picture is calico cats. Now, calico cats have got basically black and orange coloration to them. Genetically, those cats are the same all the way through. They don't have different cells that make them orange in the orange areas and different cells that make them black in the black areas. It's just that certain chromosomes are turned on or off in those regions depending on, you know, big science stuff that, we don't have to get into here. But genetically, those cats, every cell in that cat's body is the same and it comes from the same place. Now, a chimera is a situation where you have the most common is where you basically get like a Siamese twin situation, but instead of splitting apart, the two twins come together and get absorbed. And if those are two genetically different animals, like if one of them is an albino and the other is not, then you have two completely different populations of cells that make up that animal. And some of those are going to be normal pigmented and some of those are going to be albino pigmented, or some of those will be normal pigmented and some of those would have the spider patterning to them. And so you get these weird areas that have different pattern or different color. um, and that's actually a lot more common throughout the animal kingdom, throughout the human population, than you might initially think. But the reason you don't normally see it is because, by and large, people don't walk around with these massive color and pattern mutations that we see in snakes. So it gets ridiculously amplified in the reptile hobby because we're specifically selecting for pattern and color mutations. So when we get these extremely weird cases where you get a chimera, it's flagrantly obvious. But it's happened in people. There are famously a couple of court cases where like a woman was accused of having stolen babies because her children were not testing as being genetically hers. And it wasn't just like one kid. She had three kids, and none of them tested the same as hers. And at the same time, she was pregnant, and they delivered the child and genetically tested the child like right there in the hospital. And so they had all of the doctors and everybody's eyes on the child. And that child that she delivered, that was witnessed by all the people in the delivery room, did not test as being genetically related to her. And what it was one of these same situations where she had a fraternal twin that was also female and was absorbed, and twin basically became the internal organs of her body. So when they were swiping her cheek, they were getting her genetics, but the tissue that made up her ovaries and thus was giving the genetic component to her children belonged to the other, yeah, the twin that she had absorbed and made part of her. So that was why her none of her children were technically genetically hers, because they were technically her sister, but her sister was her. Um, and there have been a number of cases where something like that has come up. So that's what chimerism is. Now, then we get the thing thrown into the works. Well, let me rewind a little bit before I get into the the Kenyan sand boas. If you think about how those work, then you can see why they're not genetically heritable, because neither of those situations really is a case where you can pass that on. You cannot pass on genetically a tendency to have a twin that you absorb and thus end up with two different sets of genetics in your body. Like, that's not something that you can just pass on, so you don't tend to see that. This is why I said the calico cat thing doesn't work perfectly, because that one you can breed calico cats. Well, that segues nicely into the Kenyan sand boa thing. Well, so the reason calico and cats works is because all calico cats are female, and that's also not a true statement, but it's a basically true statement. 99.99% of calico cats are females, and the reason that is because the gene for color pigmentation for the black pigmentation is on the X chromosome, and so females have two X chromosomes. Now, the same with humans with two X chromosomes. The males have the X and the Y chromosome. Now, if you think about it logically, if the males only have one X chromosome and females have two X chromosomes, that means all females would have twice the genetic payload of an X that the male would have, which evolutionarily would be problematic, because if all the females in the species are exhibiting a double load of every gene, that could lead to problematic expression of things, or if the males can't produce that amount. So evolution has come up with ways to basically balance how that X is expressed between both sexes. And how it works in humans and how it works in cats is that randomly, one of those X chromosomes is completely packaged down so that it's silenced and none of its genes work. So if you have a cat that has a chromosome that has the gene for black on it on one X, and a chromosome that doesn't have the gene for black on the other X, then depending on which one is active is going to depend on which part of the cat is expressing black or not black. So that is heritable in as much as if I breed a black male to a black female, or to a calico female, you're not really going to have that. You're not going to have a situation. Well, you'll have half of the cats in that will get the double dose of black, so they'll always have black, 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 and you'll get the male that donates the black and the female that donates the non-black. So then the other half of the females could be calicos. But if you have a male who only is, orange, he can't donate a black. So now you get females who can get orange and black, orange from the male and black from the mother, and those become calicos. or you get the orange from the male and the non-black from the female. So then those are just automatically orange. Um, Now, something similar is probably happening with Kenyan sand boas. And I say something similar because obviously it's not just an X-linked thing like that where it's turned on and off, because both sexes in Kenyan sand boas can be paradoxing. And what, well, and it's also not an albinism gene in cats that we're dealing with, and it is an albinism type gene that we're dealing with in the Kenyan sand boas. Um, the easiest explanation I have, and this is not, this is not me saying this is the absolute, this is just a very easy way that I can explain it. Um, there is a pigmentation gene on X chromosomes, as we know from the cats that I just explained, but we also know it. We see it in birds, we see it in cattle, we see it in a whole bunch of different species, fish, and in birds and fish, there are actual indications of mutations to this pigmentation gene caused by what is called a transposon. Transposons are more colloquial known as jumping genes. Um, they were described by Barbara McClintock studying corn, and she called them that because it would seem like the genes would sort of move around in the genome. They would jump. Um, and basically, what they are is archaic viruses that don't cause disease or anything. They'll just insert in some place, and sometimes they'll just sit there and stay there forever because they get in and then they can't come out. And while they're not doing anything, they're not reproducing like a virus would, they still act as an interrupter. So if one of those genes goes into that pigment gene, one of those jumping genes, transposons, goes into that pigment gene and breaks it, now you get an albinistic phenotype. Now, every once in a while, you get a transposon that it's not completely dead. Like I said, it's not completely archaic. So it'll jump in and it'll live happily and be reproduced, moving through the genome just as like a normal piece of mutant DNA. But then something happens that causes it to turn back on and go, you know what? I'm going to jump out of here. And when it jumps back out, now it stitches that gene back together. So when it was in there, it broke the gene, but when it hops back out, the gene gets repaired. So if you have animals that are breeding like albinos mostly, but then that gene pops out in some subset of their cells, that little transposon gene pops out and the gene goes back to normal, then those cells, again, where the stem cell for that one cell pops out, then all the cells that one cell makes will have the pigment in them. So then you get that black patterning again. So like this is speculation, but it's a very neat explanation, and we have precedent for similar things happening in birds, in fish. They actually have, spontaneous revertants where they have an albino strain of zebra danios, and they're pure albino, and they start breeding them, and then they'll get normal colored ones. And when they pull those normal colored ones out and look at their genome, the transposon that was sitting in that pigment gene on the X chromosome is gone. Now it happens during that happens during meiosis phase. So the whole animal, all of the genes in that animal are normal colored and normal patterned. So it's a normal gene throughout, and it's not a true paradox. But if instead of happening in that meiosis to create the gametes, it happened just in the animal itself, you might get those little random color or randomly colored spots that would look like the paradoxed Kenyan sand boas. So that's what is probably working, but possibly, shouldn't say probably without any more solid data. That is a logical explanation as to how it could work in Kenyan sand boas. It's also possible that may be why we see freckling in the banana morph in ball pythons, because it's a very similar type of thing. It's a gene that we know is sex linked, so it's very likely on the X chromosome, or what accounts for the X chromosome. And since in ball pythons, in all pythons, uh, the X and Y are so structurally similar, they're not like in humans where the X and Y are radically different. If you look at a karyogram, you can't tell the difference between them. So it's only a little bit that's different between them. It would, again, logically, you could make an argument that since we know there's a pigmentation gene on the X chromosome, and since we've seen pigmentation genes get interrupted by this transposon, if that transposon is popping out, it would lead to little colored patches on an otherwise uncolored, an otherwise mutant colored snake.